Iowa got hammered on Saturday. That was not. I said it during the post-game show, and I did a little bit of a wrap-up on Sunday. I don't normally record segments on Sundays. Usually I cut up part of the post-game show and I'll post it. And I know people are real. First of all, people are very mad at me. That's the first part, Mark. People who watch a segment of the fan base that watches my show, they're very angry with me. And this is for a number of reasons. All right. And we don't have to make this about me, but people are angry at me. And so they're probably going to be angry because I'm again going to say what I said Sunday night. Then this is the worst loss Iowa's had, in my opinion, since 2016. And there are a few losses you could bring up that, might rival it. But given the opponent and given the impact, it's the worst loss since 2016. It might even be worse than that North Dakota State loss in 2016. For all the people that went after me in the postgame show because I said that Michigan State is not a good team. First of all, I never said they were horrible, terrible, awful like some of these teams. I think I used the word crap at one point, but I kind of grouped a lot of teams that are lower third of the Big Ten as, crap. Like when I say crap about a team, you have no business. If you're a top third tier team in the Big Ten, you have no business losing to one of those bottom tier teams. You just don't. But we found out Saturday that Iowa is not part of that top third tier. And by doing what they did Saturday, and it wasn't a fluke loss, they got beat. They got beat fair and square, lost basically every quarter. By doing what they did, they proved that, first of all, they're not going to qualify for the Big Ten title game. They're not going to qualify for a 12-team playoff spot. And we may have seen, this will upset people, but we may have seen the end of the Kirk Ferentz era in which Iowa is competitive on the semi-national level. And you may say, well, Corey, they haven't been to a playoff. Yes, but they've been in 2 Big Ten championship games over the last 3 seasons. And yes, we knew this was going to become more difficult, but we all thought they'd get at least another year. With this schedule and the guys they had back, even though the conference had expanded, the schedule was so favorable. They had so many super seniors, and it came early for Iowa. And I think that's a wake-up call to fans. And I know for me, it's like, you don't expect it to happen. And now you look forward and you're like, wow, it's hard to imagine Iowa winning enough games in the upcoming couple of years with the roster overhaul that they're going to have at season's end. And you pair that with the very mild attempt at adding players in the portal since the portal became a thing. And it's hard to imagine Iowa getting back there and being able to compete. But we'll see. I mean, each week, we're not going to stop covering Iowa. I'm sure Kirk's going to have those guys ready. As I said before the Michigan State game, I believe they should win every game left on the schedule. And I'm not that confident in that now. They might. I still think the talent is there. But boy, it didn't show up Saturday and in a number of different ways. It wasn't just offense this time.
Yeah, and just to extend on one of your points there about Iowa's competitiveness in the Big Ten and nationally during this time, for anybody who would push back on one of your points, after Penn State, Iowa and Wisconsin had the 2 most wins during the college football playoff era of teams that did not reach a playoff. So they were obviously right there a few occasions. So the 2 losses that come to mind, and I know we don't need to delve into this too deeply because people need to be directed toward the video that you posted where you did make a case for this being the worst loss for this program since 2016. But when I saw that you had posted that video, the 2 games that came to mind for me, without doing any research, looking through it, but just off the top of my head, was 2021. They have a home game against Nebraska to go to the Big Ten championship. Nebraska's awful. They're 3-8. 22, I'm sorry. They went, of course, to the Big Ten championship in 2022. And they lose that game. They get down 24-7. As you mentioned to me before we came on, it reminded me that Spencer Petras went down and Alex Padilla came into the game. They get down 24-7. They come back. They get within a score. They lose to a terrible Nebraska team. and it cost them the Western Division. And then I also think, even though we somewhat dismiss this season in totality, there was still a playoff and there was still a championship. And kind of oddly enough, 2 Blue Bloods at the very top made the championship game that year. And I'm talking about 2020, that Iowa blew, of course, 2 huge leads. Well, they blew the 17-0 game against Northwestern, or else they're playing in the Big Ten championship that year instead of Northwestern. So that game came to mind for me as well.
Yeah, that game was not on my top 3 for worst losses since 2016, but it would have probably been in my top 4. My top 3 losses, in no real particular order, but I do think this one's at the top, would have been the Nebraska game, would have been in the mix that you mentioned, 22, because even though that team was not good enough, right? They ended up 7-5. They would have been 8-4 heading to the Big Ten championship game. They should have won that game. Ended up losing to Nebraska, losing out on the West title. And then the other one would have, 2020 against Northwestern. I had that in my notes, up 17-0. The only reason it didn't make the cut is I think of the opponent, and I think of Northwestern, the fact that they did win the division. It's not like that was a bad team. The way they lost, and it was at home, the way they lost, though, that stunk. But it didn't take them out of the race right then and there. You know what I'm saying? Like, we didn't know. It was 2 games into the season. It's like, this doesn't end Iowa's chances. In the end, it cost them, but we didn't know at the time. So, yeah, I could see that argument. The one you're missing, I think, 2021. And you mentioned how 22 against Nebraska, Iowa was down 24-7, came back and lost. How about the 24-7 loss at home to Purdue in 2021? The week following Iowa-Penn State. Iowa's number 2 in the country, and you get curb stomped at home against Purdue. Now, that did not, I mean, they still went to the Big Ten championship game, but that was a horrid loss as well. and to get beat the way they got beat. Now, the only difference, too, with that is not only did they go to the Big Ten championship game still, but that was a Jeff Brom coach team that had a bit of a history of doing that to Iowa. I mean, David Bell gave them fits the year prior in 2020. They beat Iowa in 2018. And so that's why I had to go back. I went all through that, and I highlighted a few of them. Those would be a few of them. I mean, I can run through a few others here, Mark. There really weren't too many like during the Stanley era, there were some ugly losses. Like, I think of the Wisconsin game right after they beat Ohio State in 2017. But that was a good Wisconsin team. It was on the road. Like, you can't call it the loss being bad. The way they lost, they should have been more competitive without question. The Big Ten championship games were blowouts, but they were Big Ten championship games against Michigan. Bowl games don't really mean a whole lot. So you lose to Kentucky, you lose to Tennessee. The on the road loss to Purdue in 2020, but first game of the season, we didn't know what to expect of that team in the COVID year. And 2019, there really weren't any bad losses in 2019. 2018, I mentioned the road loss at Purdue. They lost at home to Northwestern, but Northwestern won the West that year. Last year you have the loss against Minnesota, but it was kind of stolen. At least fans kind of viewed it as stolen because of the Cooper DeJean thing. And 2022, I'll tell you, an ugly loss was that 9-6 loss to Illinois when Petrus and Bryan were seen on the sideline smiling after a Petrus pick. I remember that was a heavy night on the post-game show. But man, and in 2017, there was that overtime loss at Northwestern. I remember that one. Like set your stomach, just made you sick because that was a bad loss. No, I think it's the worst loss overall, if I had to rank them, since North Dakota State. And North Dakota State, it didn't take them out of the conference race, but that team was loaded. At least we perceived that team to be loaded. That was coming on the heels of the 12-0 season, and they only lost to Stanford and Michigan State, but people were so excited with the return of Beathard and Kittle and Desmond King and Josie Jewell and all those guys, and they come out and lay an egg against an FCS opponent at home. I think it's the worst loss since 2016, and there's no way to recover from it this year because there's not enough teams. There aren't enough possible losses to go around to get enough teams to 2 losses in the Big Ten. Even if Iowa wins out, like Oregon's not going to, you're not going to end up, maybe Ohio State loses to Michigan, they end up with 2 losses, but that would mean that Oregon would have to find 2 losses. Indiana would have to find 2 losses. Penn State would have to find 2 losses. It's not happening. So Kirk was asked a very good question today at media availability. How do you keep your guys engaged? He kind of gave the generic answer. Everybody goes into the season wanting to win every game, and that's what we're going to continue to focus on. But he acknowledged that this year there were different goals, and more teams have, aspirations to go big picture because you have the 12-team expanded playoff, which is phenomenal. I love it. I love the 12-team playoff. I think it's great for the sport. But boy, they blew an opportunity this year.
Yeah, what the 12-team playoff has done is provide a lot of hope for a lot of teams. And I was in that basket where they did come within inches of getting to a 4-team playoff. But realistically, most of the time, that's not within reach for more than a handful of programs. But this 12-team opens up the hope and the optimism. But then when it's taken away, then it seems even more crushing, because that seems like a real opportunity versus there's a 4-team playoff. You have to win the Big Ten. You have to be an elite team to get there versus 12. Okay, we've got a real shot at this. And the schedule set up well. And wow.
Going to Indianapolis that's the thing about the last 3 years. Even though nobody would have argued that Iowa was one of the 4 best teams in the country, going to Indy at 10-2 basically put you in the conversation each time. It puts you in the conversation whether you would have stacked up in a playoff game. Michigan State didn't stack up to Alabama in 2015, but Iowa fans would have loved to be in the playoff. I know I would have loved to watch that game, even though Iowa got their butts handed to them against Stanford. I think Stanford was one of the 4 best teams that year, but I digress. They are not going to make it to Indy, and there is that. And so even the nice thing about the last 2 of the last 3 years, and I think it helped Brian Ferentz's case for a little while, is they managed to get there, regardless of how they did it. And they dug through an ugly West Division. They managed to get there. And so, I've had a couple of people this week say, respond to some criticism from me and say, hey, you're making too much of this. They still got a lot to play for. They got a bowl game to play for. They got, you can pile up wins to help recruiting. I didn't used to be this all or nothing fan, and I try not to be. But Mark, does anybody want to hear that midway through a season? With all the hype that goes into college football season, the season's not that long anyways. Count down the days. You get, you go the whole off season hearing about portal news, hearing about guys returning, hearing about development and all these different things to win. No one wants to play the games to play for the future. Now, when you go through a coaching change, you've accepted that that's sometimes what happens, although that hasn't happened with Indiana. Normally there is a bit of a dip there, and that's why they call it a rebuild. But nobody was going into this offseason looking at this season as being a rebuild year. So it's a disappointment regardless of where Iowa finishes.
So how much does it matter to you if this team goes, let's say they run the table, they're going to miss the playoffs. So we've got a comment in the chat from somebody who says, I think it's actually a super chat. So let's get to it with, there's still a 2+% chance of making the playoffs. I can't help myself. And yes, Ben, I get it. You hold on to that last final hope and try to find a way and figure out a way and all that. But aside from the miraculous, going 9-3 and then having everything else in the country fall into place, do you care as an Iowa fan? And we'll ask this same question to everyone in the chat. Do you care if they go 9-3 and go to a nice bowl game versus going fill in the blank, 7-5, 6-6? Does it matter? It seems to matter to many less fans than it used to, that wanted every single win. Let's get to a nice bowl game. If we get to the Outback Bowl or the Citrus Bowl, that's a good year. And we went 9-3 versus, if we can't make the playoff, who cares?
I remember it mattering. I'm not that old. I remember 2008. That South Carolina game in 2008 was fun to watch them, climb back to 8-4 and then put a beat down on the Gamecocks. But frankly, not really. Like, you want them to win every game, but it's just totally different rooting for your team from a perspective of pride or let's get one more win on the resume, or let's get one more win to help recruiting, or hey, we got a few guys on campus this weekend. Be great to show out. And it's totally different. And that's why I love the 12-team expanded playoff. I've always argued against the people that say it makes the regular season less important. I just think it makes more games more important.
Yeah.
And that's why I love it. And I'm an advocate for 16. I think you stop at 16, but I'd like to see 16.